Curse of the Headless Bride. In the heart of Brazil, far from the lights of the cities and deeper than the jungle roots that strangle stone and bone alike, there is a sound that rides the night. It begins with hooves, pounding, furious, coming, from nowhere and everywhere at once. Then comes the heat, the scent of ash, the trembling of the air, and then the silence. What you are hearing is not a horse. It is not an animal. It is what remains of a soul torn in two. A woman wronged by love, by religion, and by a curse so old that even the trees bow in fear. They call her the headless mule, the Mula, Cabeça. But she was a woman once. Her name was Beatriz, and before she rode into fire, she walked among us. This is her story. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Wedding. The village of São Miguel do Mato was not marked on any modern map. Tucked between rolling hills and dense groves of jacarandá, it clung to the forgotten edges of the world like a spiderweb to an old chapel wall. There were no paved roads, no electricity, only dirt paths and oil lamps, and stories passed down, by voice, unchanged for centuries. It was here that Beatriz was born. The midwife who delivered her claimed the child had opened her eyes before her first cry. Wide, dark eyes that didn't blink as the storm thundered above the hut. Lightning cracked, and the woman crossed herself 3 times. "She sees too much," she had muttered. Best not to look too long into eyes like that. Beatriz's mother, a widow named Lenita, did not listen. She wrapped her daughter in red linen and wept with joy. From the beginning, Beatriz was different. She grew quiet, sharp, graceful. Her presence in a room was like smoke, soft, floating, but impossible to ignore. By the age of 12, she had memorized every page of the crumbling hymnal used in the chapel. By 16, she spoke Latin more fluently than the priest himself, and by 17, she had fallen in love with the wrong man. Father Anselmo was not like the other priests who had passed through São Miguel. He was young, no older than 30, clean-shaven, with a voice like falling water and hands that looked too gentle for scripture. When he arrived, he'd said he was sent to bring order to the region, but even the elders suspected he was hiding from something. He smiled often, but it never touched his eyes. Beatriz first saw him during Mass, standing behind the altar, reading from Matthew. Her mother noticed the way her daughter stared and whispered, "Eyes forward, child." But Beatriz did not stop staring. Nor did. It began with confession, then quiet conversations after Mass, then nights under the fig tree behind the chapel. They spoke of poetry, of the stars, of God, and whether love could ever be holy when men were the ones who said what was sacred. It was there under that tree that he kissed her. The wind held its breath. The candles inside the chapel guttered. Somewhere in the jungle an owl screamed. They kept their secret for months, but secrets don't survive in São Miguel. It was the baker's boy who saw them first. Beatriz and Anselmo, hands touching in the shadows behind the chapel, eyes locked, in a moment too long, too close. He told his mother, who told the woman who sold candles, who told the sacristan. By dusk, every mouth in the village knew. By dawn, the priest was called before the council of elders. Beatriz watched from behind the chapel's cracked wooden door as Father Anselmo stood with bowed head, his hands trembling at his sides. "He has defiled his vow," the eldest elder declared. "He has brought sin upon our altar. A priest who lays with a woman is no longer a priest. He is a man, and no man walks with God while lying in flesh." There was no trial. There was no defense. The church bell rang 3 times that afternoon, and when it stopped, so did the name Anselmo. They erased him. He was never spoken of again. That night, Beatriz searched for him. She went to the fig tree, the chapel, the sacristy. She walked the edge of the forest, calling softly into the dark. But there was nothing, no trail, no note, no farewell. The next morning, the altar was scrubbed clean with vinegar and lime. A new priest was promised, one from the city, holy and proper, and Beatrice was left behind. She became a shadow. People crossed themselves when she passed. Mothers pulled their children inside. No one spoke to her, but the whispers always followed. Witch. Whore. She burned him away. Beatrice stopped attending Mass. Her mother wept behind closed doors. And the sky over São Miguel grew darker each day. Then the fires began. It started with a goat. Old Terencio found it in the field behind his barn, eyes wide, black tongue swollen and split. Its body was intact, but its fur was scorched and smoking. Then the chickens stopped laying. Then the well turned cloudy. Then, 3 nights later, the chapel bell rang at midnight, once, then twice. No one had pulled the rope. The elders held an emergency meeting. Prayers were said. Holy water was sprinkled. The new priest, Father Mauricio, arrived from Aracaju and declared a mass of purification would be held at sunrise. But when the sun rose, the chapel's door was blackened. Charred handprints streaked the wood, and on the altar sat a single red scarf, Beatrice's. Her mother swore she had been in bed the entire night, but no one believed her. The villagers grew restless. Fear festered beneath their skin like a fever. And Beatrice, walking through the market the next day, heard someone hiss, "The devil rides her shadow." It was no longer whispers, it was a curse, and curses in São Miguel never ended quietly. That evening, the air thickened. A storm loomed on the horizon, its belly full of heat and fire. The villagers barred their doors, shutters were nailed shut, crosses were hung on every wall. The square fell silent before nightfall. But Beatrice stood outside. She had no reason to hide. Her scarf had been returned by Father Mauricio without a word. His eyes trembled in their sockets when he gave it back, as if he wanted to ask her something, or confess something. He did neither. Instead, he scheduled another purification mass. But Beatrice didn't attend. She walked to the fig tree where she and Anselmo had once spoken of stars and salvation. The tree had grown since then. Its trunk split in two like a wound. She laid the scarf at its roots and said nothing. Lightning cracked above the chapel. The storm had arrived. That night, fire returned to São Miguel. The wind howled like a woman in pain. Thunder shook the hills. But it wasn't lightning that struck the granary. It was something else. Something that left behind no scorch marks, only hoof prints burned into the earth, and a trail of ash leading to Beatrice's home. By morning, the granary was nothing but blackened timber and steam. Cattle refused to cross the eastern field. Dogs howled from inside locked homes, their muzzles pressed to the floor. Father Mauricio declared it an act of God, a divine test, but no one believed him, because every soul in São Miguel had seen the prints. Hooves pressed deep into the earth, glowing faintly like embers beneath ash. They started at the granary and ended at Lenita's doorstep. Inside, Beatrice sat calmly at the kitchen table. Her hands were stained with soot. Her hair smelled of smoke. Her mother was gone. The neighbors said they had heard shouting the night before, something about forgiveness, something about fire. But Lenita was nowhere to be found. Only her rosary remained, melted into the threshold. The council called a gathering. For the first time in the village's history, they invoked the ancient rite, a maldição da terra queimada, the curse of the scorched earth. It was reserved for witches, for the possessed, for women who no longer belonged to God. Beatrice was summoned to the square, and this time, she did not walk alone. She was led by 2 elders, wrapped in white linen, her hands bound by flax. And as she stepped onto the stone platform beneath the chapel bell, she smiled. The crowd encircled the platform, Old women clutched their crosses. Men lowered their eyes. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts. Father Maurizio stood before them, holding a copy of the Book of Psalms with trembling hands. Beatrice said nothing. Her eyes roamed the faces of her neighbors, once warm, now stone. She recognized the baker, the seamstress, the man who used to bring her apples after Mass. All of them silent, all of them watching. The bell tolled once, and then the sentence was spoken. She shall be cast out from blessed ground. Her name shall be forgotten. Her body denied burial. Her soul surrendered to flame. The flax ropes were undone, but no one moved. Beatrice stepped forward on her own, walked through the crowd, down the chapel steps, toward the edge of the village where the jungle thickened. No one followed. It was part of the curse. She was to walk alone, into exile, into legend, and when she disappeared beyond the trees, the crowd exhaled as one. But that night, the bell rang again, 12 times, and this time, no one had pulled the rope. They searched for her the next morning, not to bring her back, but to confirm she was gone. Men with rifles, machetes, and oil lamps fanned into the jungle at sunrise. They expected to find a body, a trail, ashes, something. Instead, they found hoof prints, burned into the soil. The leaves nearby were scorched, curled in on themselves like the forest had recoiled from the path. The fig tree behind the chapel, where Beatrice and Anselmo had once spoken of stars, was split in half. Inside its hollow, the walls were black. The priest ordered the search called off. "She is no longer ours," he said, and crossed himself 3 times. But some of the men disagreed. João de Ferro, a hunter and former soldier, stayed behind. He had seen something in the trees the night before, a flash of red, the sound of hooves and a cry, not of a mule, but of a woman. He gathered his supplies, packed a canteen, and swore to follow the tracks until they stopped. "They don't stop," said one of the elders. "They ride in circles," João answered. "Then I'll walk until I'm dizzy." And he vanished into the trees. João followed the hoof prints for 2 full days. They weaved through thickets no animal had ever passed, crossed streams that sizzled under the sun, and climbed hills where birds refused to perch. At night, he made small fires and slept with one eye open. But it was the silence that disturbed him most. No crickets, no frogs, only the occasional thud of hooves in the dark, and once, the unmistakable sound of weeping. On the 3rd morning, he reached a clearing he'd never seen before. It was circular, perfect. The grass was blackened. The center bore the shape of a woman's figure, etched in ash, and in the middle, lying quietly, was a single flax rope, the same that had once bound Beatrice's wrists. João picked it up. It was warm. The moment he touched it, the air shifted. A low growl echoed from the tree line. Then came the gallop. Fast, furious, fire in its wake. João drew his machete, but when the creature burst into the clearing, he did not strike. He only stared, because it wasn't a mule, not really. It was a woman on fire, headless, her neck a fountain of flame, and she was crying. Chapter 2. Ash and Blood. João did not scream. He could not. His throat locked, seized by the firelight blooming from the thing's neck, a plume of flame where a head should be. The mule's body heaved, muscles slick with sweat and ash, steam rising in ghostly spirals as the ground scorched beneath its hooves. Its eyes were gone, its face was gone, and yet he felt it staring. The scent of burning linen choked the clearing. João dropped the flax rope and stumbled backward, falling to one knee. He'd fought in jungles, faced death more than once, but never like this. Never with something that bled fire and cried like a mother who'd lost her child. The beast pawed the ground. João whispered a prayer. "Em nome de Deus." The mule shrieked. not like any animal he had ever heard, but like wind through a cracked bell, grating and hollow. The fire pulsed higher. A circle of flame spread around its hooves, and in that moment, he saw her. Not the beast, the woman inside. Beatrice. For a fraction of a second, through the fire, her face appeared, twisted in agony, eyes filled with grief, and then it was gone. The mule turned and vanished into the trees, leaving behind only scorched leaves and the trail of hoofprints seared into earth. João lay on the ground until the sunrise cut through the canopy. The curse had returned, and it had a name. João returned to the village a day later, silent and hollow-eyed. His boots were torn, his hands blistered, and the edges of his coat were blackened by fire. When he stepped into the square, the conversations stopped. Chickens clucked nervously, and the dogs began to bark from behind gates. The elders emerged. From the chapel, their faces already creased with expectation. "She's not dead," João said simply. They asked no questions. He told no lies. He walked past them all and locked himself in his home, placing the flax rope, still warm, beneath his bed. That night, another barn burned. This time, there were witnesses. They described a red glow moving like lightning across the fields. They heard hooves, screams, and the unmistakable sound of a woman crying into the dark. The next morning, they found Father Mauricio's cassock folded on the chapel floor. No blood, no body, only hoofprints leading from the altar to the doors. Beatrice had returned, but she was not alone. The curse had changed, and it was no longer content with wandering. It wanted to burn. The following day, the council convened in the chapel. The pews were half empty. Some villagers refused to leave their homes, while others had already begun packing their belongings to flee São Miguel entirely. João sat at the back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "We must seek intervention," said Elder Bento. "The curse is beyond our rituals. We need a priest, no, an exorcist from the capital." "But what would they know of her?" spat an old woman. "They never knew Beatrice. They never saw what we did." "She was one of us," murmured a soft voice from the corner. Heads turned. It was Marta, Beatrice's childhood friend. She hadn't spoken publicly since the exile. She was kind, Marta continued, rising, and she was in love. And for that, we buried her in whispers and shame. Elder Bento's voice cracked. She defied sacred law. She defied your law. The room trembled with silence. Then came the distant sound of hooves. Slow, deliberate. The oil lamp above the altar flickered. The crucifix trembled against the wall. The villagers burst out into the square. Smoke rose from the east field and carved into the scorched earth, perfectly symmetrical, were the words, "I remember everything." The words in the earth chilled every man, woman, and child who saw them. I remember everything. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. The villagers stopped speaking after that. They walked in hushed pairs, avoided the chapel, locked their doors before sunset. But the fire still came. Each night, a new place was marked. A home, a barn, a trail. Always the same. Scorched prints, soot on the walls, a scent like burnt linen and charred roses. João watched the signs grow bolder. He began carving symbols into his walls, old protection markings from his grandfathers. Stories. He lit candles around his home, reciting prayers not found in any scripture. But the spiral kept tightening. Marta returned to the fig tree behind the chapel. It had begun to bloom again, despite the dry season. Its bark had blackened, but its flowers were blood-red, sweet-scented, unnatural. She knelt beside the roots, whispering Beatrice's name. A wind passed, and for a brief moment, she heard a voice. "Answer. Why didn't you speak for me?" Marta screamed, and that night the church itself burned. Flames climbed the chapel walls like they were summoned. The bell tower collapsed in a cascade of embers, and the stone crucifix above the altar split clean down the center. No one came to put it out. The villagers stood at the edge of the square, watching silently. João arrived too late. The sky was already painted orange. The roof cracked like bone. Marta knelt on the cobblestones, her face streaked with soot, eyes locked on the burning sanctuary. She spoke to me, she whispered as João pulled her back. What did she say? Marta looked up. Her voice was hollow. She asked why I stayed silent. The next day, they buried the chapel's ashes. They didn't speak of rebuilding. No one prayed. The place that once held God now felt like it belonged to someone, or something else. And still, the fire came. Homes were abandoned, carts overturned, livestock left their pens and wandered into the jungle. The village began to hollow out, like fruit rotting from the inside. But João stayed, and so did Marta. Because they knew what everyone else refused to say. The headless mule didn't want revenge. She wanted to be heard, and until someone truly listened, she would ride. João couldn't sleep, not because of the heat, not even because of the fear, but because he had begun to hear her in his dreams, not the shriek of the beast, the voice of Beatrice, soft, low, sorrowful. She whispered things he couldn't understand. Names, prayers, half-forgotten lullabies, and always, the sound of hooves, slow, echoing, fading into the dark. He began to write them down. Every night he sat by candlelight and recorded what he remembered, not just dreams, feelings, colors, fragments of stories he'd never lived but somehow knew. A woman in white by a river, a priest weeping before a shattered altar. A child born during an eclipse. Marta joined him. She brought herbs, old scrolls, fragments of legends her grandmother once whispered. They pieced it together. It wasn't just Beatrice. She was part of a lineage, a legacy of women silenced and scorched beneath dogma. The curse was older than the village, older than the chapel. And it had a root. They just had to find it. The trail led them to the hills. Beyond the village, past the fig grove and the crumbling stone wall that marked the oldest part of São Miguel, there was a path no one had walked in years. It was choked with vines, thorny underbrush, and the heavy scent of rain-soaked earth. Marta walked ahead, her lantern swaying. João followed, machete in hand, clearing the way. They didn't speak. The silence between them was thick with unspoken truths and the echo of distant hooves that never quite reached. At the top of the ridge, they found it. An abandoned chapel, smaller than the one in São Miguel, but older, far older. Its wood was petrified, gray with age, the cross on its roof, broken and hanging by a rusted nail. Inside they found nothing but ash, no altar, no pews, only soot, and burned into the center of the floor. A spiral. João stepped forward and dropped to one knee. He brushed the ash with his fingers. Beneath it, a symbol, one he had seen in his dreams. Woman's silhouette with flames rising from her throat. Marta gasped. This is where it began. They spent hours in the chapel ruins. João took notes. Marta sketched the spiral and the burning figure, her hands shaking but steady enough to preserve every detail. As dusk approached, they unearthed fragments buried in the soot. Charred beads. From a broken rosary, a rusted bridle pin, scorched pages of prayer written in a hand that predated the village. They pieced it together by firelight. It wasn't just Beatrice. There had been others. Women, outcast and condemned. Branded by faith, blamed for sin. Forced into silence, into exile, into flame. Each time the mule returned. Each time The hooves came. But each time, the village refused to see the pattern. Juan touched the spiral again. It pulsed under his palm, warm, steady, alive. "It's not a curse," Marta whispered. "It's a memory." Juan stood. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke from the valley below. He didn't need to look. He knew. Another fire had begun. The mule was riding, and this time she wasn't just haunting the village. She was reclaiming it. Chapter 3. The Midnight Ride. The air in San Miguel turned electric, not with weather but with something older, like the hum of power before a storm that never breaks. The birds stopped singing. The wind refused to move. The forest watched. The people watched too, at first from behind windows and shuttered doors, then from rooftops and balconies, lanterns low, candles flickering in cupped hands. Something was coming, something they all felt, and none of them could stop it. At precisely midnight, the first sound came, a single hoofbeat, then another, then a gallop. The sound echoed, not just through streets, but through walls, through teeth, through memory. Chickens panicked in their coops. Dogs barked until they choked, and then she appeared, a streak of fire tearing through the square. A creature not entirely of flesh, not entirely of spirit. Her body was that of a mule, blackened and cracked, muscles moving like coals under skin. But where her head should have been, there was only flame. It poured upward like a torch, white-hot and screaming. Every hoofstep left fire in its wake. Every breath melted the edges of the night. She circled the chapel ruins, once, twice, then stopped, and screamed. It wasn't a sound that came from a mouth. It came from the earth, from the sky, from inside. Everyone who heard it, Beatrice had returned, and the midnight ride had begun. The scream shattered more than silence. Windows cracked, lamps extinguished, crops in the fields withered in a single gust of heat. The headless mule galloped down Rua do Norte, her flaming neck casting monstrous shadows along the cobblestones. Her hooves struck sparks from stone, leaving glowing trails like veins across the earth. No one dared step outside. Those who watched saw the firestorm blur past their homes, a blur of mane and muscle and smoke. They felt her pass like a fever. Glass trembled in their cupboards. Holy icons fell from walls. At the far end of the village, where the trees grew close and the ground dipped into old stone steps, Juan waited. He had not slept. He stood holding the flax rope he had once dropped, in fear, now soaked in holy water and wrapped in iron beads. A crude bridle hung from his shoulder, forged by his own hands. Marta stood behind him, her hands covered in ash, her face streaked with charcoal. She held a lantern made from a broken altar candle, its light flickering in rhythm with the creature's. "Hoofbeats. She'll come this way," Juan said. Marta nodded. "She always does." Then came the fire, blazing between the trees, lighting the fog in orange ribbons. Then came the hooves and the scream. The headless mule burst into the clearing. Juan stood his ground, though his legs trembled beneath him. The fire around her neck roared like a furnace, swirling into the low branches and lighting the air in hues of orange and red. The grass ignited in a circle as she skidded to a halt. Marta whispered a prayer behind him. The mule pawed the earth. 1. Step 2. Her form trembled like a mirage. She hissed steam with every breath. Her ribs showed through blackened flesh. Her hooves cracked stone. Juan raised the bridle. "Beatrice," he called, loud enough to challenge the fire. The beast stopped. He took 1 step forward. "I know your name. I know your sorrow. I saw the chapel. I saw the roots." The fire pulsed, but the mule did not charge. Marta stepped beside him now, the lantern held high. "We're not here to bind you," she said. "We're here to remember." The mule twitched. Her body shifted, flickered, as if something inside her struggled to hold shape. Then came the Voice, from nowhere, from everywhere. I was never silent. You were deaf. Juon dropped to his knees, not out of fear, but reverence. The voice that spoke wasn't demonic. It wasn't monstrous. It was human, wounded. It echoed through the clearing like a sob, lost to the wind. Marta lowered the lantern, letting its flicker die. The light wasn't needed anymore. The mule took a step forward. The flames dimmed slightly, shifting from white-hot to ember-red. Her body trembled, and for a moment the creature seemed to buckle. Like something inside was breaking free, Juon laid the bridle at her feet. "We're not here to chain you," he whispered. "We're here to listen." Silence followed. Then the forest responded. The trees bent inward. The leaves stopped moving. The fire held, and the mule knelt. Her front legs folded, her body bowed, and the flames extinguished without smoke, leaving only heat in the air, where her head should have been. A soft glow hovered, and within it, Beatrice's face, eyes closed, tears of fire rolling down her cheeks. For a long moment, no one moved. The clearing seemed to pulse with the weight of centuries, grief compressed into breath, pain bound into memory. The face of Beatrice shimmered like a dying ember, her expression not angry but exhausted. Juon's voice cracked as he spoke. "Why are you still riding?" Her eyes opened slowly. In them, the reflection of flames. "Because no one remembers the truth," she said. The words fell from the air and landed on the earth like coals. Juon lowered his head. "Then tell us. Let us carry it." Beatrice blinked once. The mule's body shifted, shuddered, as if resisting some ancient instinct to run. Then it calmed. And around them, the forest began to breathe. The trees swayed gently, though no wind blew. The stars above brightened. The ash in the air rose, dancing like fireflies, and Beatrice began to speak. Not in words, not in sound, but in memory. Marta gasped as images flooded her mind. Visions not hers, not Juon's. A burning altar, a voice shouting scripture, a door slammed, a hand raised, a woman weeping, begging to be heard. Then flames, always flames. The curse wasn't born from sin. It was born from silence. The memories grew stronger. Juon staggered back as they flooded his mind. No longer flashes, but entire moments. Scenes replayed with unbearable clarity. He saw Beatrice as a girl, alone in the pews, praying with her whole heart. He saw Anselmo trembling with guilt, writing a letter he would never send. He saw the council, gathering in the night, deciding her fate with hands stained not by righteousness, but fear. He saw the moment they cursed her. He felt it, the heat, the betrayal, the silence that followed. Marta fell to her knees, overwhelmed. Tears streamed down her face. "This wasn't a punishment," she whispered. "It was a burial." The forest groaned. The spiral beneath their feet, etched in ash and root, glowed, faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Beatrice's flame flickered again. "You cannot lift the curse," she said, "but you can carry the truth." Juon nodded. The fire around the mule dimmed, as though soothed by recognition, and for the first time in decades, the galloping stopped. The next morning, the village awoke to silence. No hoofprints, no ash. The chapel ruins still stood, scorched and skeletal. But the air was still. The fire was gone. Juon and Marta returned at sunrise. Neither spoke on the walk back. They moved like survivors of a storm that hadn't touched their skin, but had burned their bones. The square was empty. The villagers had stayed inside. Fear lingered in the doorways. But as Juon stepped into the open, lantern in hand, Marta beside him, the doors began to creak open. He held up the bridle, blackened but whole. "She's not gone," Juon said. "She's watching, waiting." But the ride is over, for now. Marta stepped forward. We saw her, we heard her, and we remember. The elders exchanged glances. Some nodded. Others looked away. But for the first time, no one whispered. That night, they gathered around the fig tree. Not to pray, to speak. And Beatrice's name was said aloud, a name no longer buried in fire. Chapter 4. The Chains and the Mask. The days that followed were thick with silence. No more fires burned, no hoofprints appeared. The villagers emerged from their homes slowly, blinking into the light like animals too long caged. São Miguel was quiet, but not at peace. It felt like the air had settled in warning, not in forgiveness. João stood beneath the fig tree, his fingers brushing the bark where the flames had once licked. His hands were raw, bandaged with cloth and prayer. He had not slept. He did not eat much. The memory of Beatrice's face glowing from within the blaze would not let him rest. Marta arrived just after dawn. She carried a parcel wrapped in old linen, its corners dark with soot. Inside was a rusted iron bridle, curved, sharp, forged, for a creature not entirely human. I found it buried beneath the altar ruins, she said. In the old chapel. João took it gently. The metal was heavier than it should have been. It's one of the original ones, she whispered. The kind they used in the oldest rituals. They didn't bind animals with these, they bound women. They sat beneath the fig tree, no birds sang above them. The roots stretched wide beneath the soil, tangled and ancient. We need to know what it means, João said. Marta nodded. Then we need to go deeper. By nightfall, they were already packed. João brought the old bridle, the flax rope from the clearing, and a blade his grandfather had once claimed was blessed by blood. Marta carried notebooks, herbs, a bottle of moon water, and a candle that burned blue flame. Their path was not marked, but they followed the trees that bowed. The ones whose branches reached in rather than out, the ones whose roots curled like fingers instead of splitting like veins. The deeper they walked, the colder it became. Not with wind, not with air, but with memory. We're not the first, Marta whispered. I know, João replied. They reached a hollow just before midnight. The moon hung low, red and swollen, and at the center of the clearing was a ring of stones. But they weren't natural. Each one had been carved. Faces, dozens of them, women, all different, eyes shut, mouths sealed. In the middle sat a mask, wooden, split down the middle. Its eyes were holes, and it looked like it was waiting. João approached the mask slowly. The carved faces in the stone circle seemed to shift in the flickering lantern light, expressions contorting between sorrow and silence. The air buzzed around them with the tension of held breath. He knelt before the mask. It looks like her, he murmured. Marta joined him. Or all of them. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a single feather, black, smooth and stiff, a relic from a crow that had perched on Beatrice's windowsill the night before her exile. Together, they placed the bridle beside the mask. The flax rope was coiled like a serpent around its base. Marta lit the blue candle. A wind swept through the hollow. The trees groaned, and the eyes of the mask began to glow, not with fire, but with memory. A voice filled the clearing, not from the air, but from the stones. Who seeks the truth must carry the weight. João bowed his head. I carry it, he said. Then wear it, the voice replied, and the mask lifted on its own. João did not reach for the mask. He waited. It hovered before him, suspended in the trembling air, swaying gently like it was being held by invisible fingers. Then without a sound it moved toward his face. Marta started to intervene but stopped. Joan's eyes were wide, not in fear but in recognition. The mask sealed over his features. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the fire returned. Not around them, within. The blue candle flared high and split into 7 tongues of flame, each one pointing to a different carved face in the circle. Joan's body shuddered. He saw her, Beatrice, standing beneath the old fig tree, smiling at someone who would not come. He saw the flames around her as the rope was tied. He felt the breath leave her lungs. He felt the silence that followed. And then he felt them all. Every woman who had worn the curse, every step, every scream, every ride. When the mask fell away, Joan collapsed to his knees. He was crying. Marta caught him before he hit the ground. "I saw them," he gasped. "I know," she said. "So did I." They stayed in the clearing until dawn. Neither spoke. The fire from the candle died slowly, as if reluctant to let go. The mask lay still on the soil, but something about the way it sat, upright, watching, kept Marta from packing it away. Joan's breathing slowed. He sat cross-legged in the middle of the stone circle, eyes closed, sweat drying on his brow. "It wasn't just Beatrice," he said softly. "I know," Marta replied. "She was the last, but not the first." Joan's voice was steadier now, as if the mask had left something inside him, something old. Joan met them and felt himself drop to his knees. "There are more," she said. Her voice echoed through the trees, into the stones, through the bones buried in the valley. She looked behind her, and from the pit, others began to rise. They came, like mist, not ghosts, not shadows, but memory made flesh, each woman bearing the marks of fire, iron, and silence. Their feet did not disturb the earth. Their eyes were open. Joan counted 12, then 20, then more. Some wore veils. Others bore the chains that once bound them. One carried a burned ribbon in her hand, its crimson now dull with time. Marta couldn't breathe, not from fear, but reverence. These were not monsters. These were stories erased. Helena stood at the front. She looked at Joan. "They have names. You must write them." Joan reached for his notebook. The pages flipped on their own, pen lifted by an unseen hand. One by one, the names were etched into the paper, each one a name lost to fire. Each. One returned. Marta added dates, fragments of towns, snatches of prayers. Together they rebuilt what the world had buried. When the last name was written, Helena stepped back. The others followed. And as they sank into the soil, the graves closed gently behind them, not as tombs, but as memorials, this time with names. When the valley stilled, Marta stepped forward and pressed her palm into the earth. It was warm. Joan stood beside her, notebook still open, the ink of the last name barely dry. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was sacred. It vibrated like a held breath, not in fear, but in reverence. The mist began to clear. The stones no longer looked cold. The trees lifted their branches toward the sun. They left the mask behind, and the bridle, and the box. These things belonged to the valley now, not as instruments of silence, but as relics of a story finally told. As they climbed the ridge back toward São Miguel, they felt lighter, but not empty. Behind them, the valley shimmered, still hidden, still quiet, but no longer forgotten. Joan looked down once more. The earth below spelled one word in petals and ash: Helena. And above it, carved into the tree at the top of the hill, were 2 more. Beatrice lives. Chapter 6. The Fire That Walks. The fires returned before the second harvest, but this time they didn't come with hoofbeats. They came in silence. Crops blackened in the soil. Wells steamed in the early dawn. The chickens laid eggs cooked in their shells. It was as if the heat had learned to walk without warning. The village didn't speak of Beatrice anymore, not out of disrespect, but reverence. Her name had become something too sacred to utter, like a prayer carved in ash. João stood in the square as the sun rose. The light felt wrong, too red, too thick. It cast long shadows that twisted even when the wind did not move. In his hand, he held the notebook of names. Marta joined him with a lantern that had not been lit in days. "There, watching again," she said. João nodded, but not just from the valley. He turned and looked toward the horizon, beyond the village, beyond the forest. Smoke was rising, not one column, many. The first reports came from Santa Luzia, a village 3 ridges east. The smoke was thick, unnatural, sour, with the stench of sulfur and scorched leather. João and Marta arrived as the last rooftop fell. The town was empty, not ruined, emptied. Doors stood open, meals half-eaten, clothes hung on lines. But there were no people, only ash where footprints should be, and spirals, burned into thresholds drawn into dust, carved into trees. Some were small, some were wide enough to encircle entire homes, all pulsing faintly when the light dimmed. At the chapel, the bell lay shattered in the grass. No bridle, no mask, just a name scorched into the altar stone. Helena. João gripped the edge of the stone, breathing hard. "She's walking," he whispered. Marta placed a hand on his shoulder. Not alone. The ground beneath them warmed, and in the distance, the sound of fire. Footsteps made of flame. They followed the spiral trail out of Santa Luzia at dawn. The path wound west, etched into the earth like scars. Trees leaned away from the marks. Ferns curled inwards. Animals refused to cross. After 2 hours of walking, they found the first remnant, a child's toy, singed, still warm, then a scarf, then a pair of sandals turned backward. No bodies, only items left behind, arranged like offerings. At a fork in the trail, the earth was black. João knelt and pressed his palm to it. Heat bled into his fingers. Marta lit a candle and set it in the center. The flame turned blue. "She's not just moving," Marta said softly. "She's guiding us." They walked until nightfall. No stars showed. Only fireflies circling in spirals, lighting the path until it opened into a new valley. There, in the distance, they saw the next village, already burning. The fire was too clean. No smoke clung to the sky. No ash drifted on the wind. But the glow pulsed from within homes, barns, the chapel, like the buildings had been set alight from the inside out. João and Marta stood on the ridge, unmoving. The wind brought no sound of screams, only hooves. They descended slowly, skirting the perimeter. João carried the notebook now pressed tight against his chest. Marta gripped a bundle of dried herbs, her mouth silently reciting the names of the women they had written in the valley. They passed an abandoned well. Inside, spirals lined the stones, scorched into the moss. A door creaked open. They turned sharply. Figure stood in the light, no taller than a child wrapped in lace and shadow. No face, but in place of a head, a crown of flame. Marta stepped forward. "Beatrice." The figure didn't answer. Instead it turned and walked into the fire. They rushed toward the doorway. Inside, the room burned with a heat that did not scorch. The furniture remained whole, the walls intact, but the air shimmered like a mirage. The flame radiating from the figure's crown swirling through the room like a storm held still. Marta stepped in first. She did not burn, neither did João. The figure stood at the center of the room, its form now more defined. Lace unraveled into threads of smoke. Its body pulsed with ember light from within, and when it turned again, they saw her. Beatrice. Her face was whole. Her eyes glowed, not with rage, but with exhaustion. Her mouth moved, but no sound escaped. Marta stepped forward. We saw Helena. We remembered her. Beatrice's head tilted. João opened the notebook. He read the names, one by one, slowly. With each name, the fire calmed. With each memory spoken, the room cooled, and when the last name was read, Beatrice spoke. You remembered her. Now, remember me. Beatrice stepped forward. The fire around her dimmed to a low, steady glow. The room pulsed, not with heat, but with something deeper, sorrow, memory, relief. João lowered the notebook. Beatrice, what do you want us to do? She raised her hand and pointed, not to them, but beyond the wall, past the window, toward the hills where new fires now bloomed. There are others, she whispered. Her voice was like dry wind through forest leaves, fragile, ancient. Marta's eyes welled with tears. Are they like you? Beatrice nodded. They are not curses, they are echoes, wounds still open. João turned. Then we have to go to them. Beatrice stepped back into the center of the room. The flames rose around her once more, not consuming but shielding. Her figure blurred. You remembered, she said. The fire lifted her, and in a gust of golden sparks, she was gone. Only a single word remained, burned into the wood beneath their feet. Right. They left the village at dawn. No one stopped them. No one asked questions. The people had seen the fire, heard the hooves, felt the silence afterward. João carried the notebook like scripture. Marta walked beside him with the old mask strapped to her pack, its cracked face now mended by golden twine she couldn't remember weaving. They followed the spirals. Some were faint, drawn in dust or dew. Others burned into stone or etched in frost. The further they walked, the stranger the signs became. They reached a crossroads by midday. The wind shifted, and in the distance they heard drums. Not loud, but steady. They weren't alone anymore. At the crest of the next ridge, they saw a group of figures gathered in a wide clearing. Not a village, not a cult. Witnesses, some carried torches. Others sat in circles whispering names. And at the center, spinning slowly, was a spiral of fire. João and Marta stepped into the clearing. Dozens of eyes turned toward them, young and old, dark and wide, all reflecting the fire that spun at the center of the spiral. No one spoke, but something passed between them. Recognition. Marta opened the notebook and began to read. Names, dates, stories lost to fire and silence. Each word ignited the flames higher. A woman stepped forward holding a ribbon soaked in wine. She placed it at the edge of the spiral. A man laid down a melted silver pendant. A child pressed her palm into the dirt and left behind a glowing print. Beatrice's fire was no longer alone. Helena's voice had echoed, and now others remembered. Too. João stepped to the center and placed the notebook at the spiral's heart. The flames consumed it. Not with smoke, but with light. The spiral rose into the sky, a cyclone of memory, fire, and breath. And from its center, a voice. You've seen us. Now let them hear. Chapter 7. The Last Transformation. The spiral did not fade. It spread. Wherever names had been spoken, wherever fire had risen in silence, the spiral left its mark, etched into stone, braided into hair, pressed into skin like a memory too old to forget. João and Marta had become messengers. They traveled across valleys and mountains into villages where the people still whispered of hoofbeats and flame. In every place, they lit a candle, read a name, and waited. Sometimes they were met with reverence, sometimes with suspicion, but always, always. Something stirred. In one town, a woman wept at the sound of Helena's name. In another, a child recited a prayer she claimed had come to her in a dream, 7 words repeated in firelight. I saw her. She was not alone. The message was clear. The fire had never been about vengeance. It had always been about witness, but not all would carry it willingly. Not all would listen, and in a forgotten house, at the edge of a ravine where trees grew twisted and birds flew silent, a girl began to burn. Not her flesh, her dreams. Her name was Clara. 17 years old, a girl who had never stepped foot in São Miguel, who had never heard the name Beatriz or Helena. But she had dreams. Dreams of hooves striking stone, of smoke leaking through mirrors, of a voice, familiar and foreign, whispering, "It's your turn now." At first, she didn't speak of them. Her mother blamed fever. The doctor prescribed herbs and rest, but the dreams continued. One morning, she woke to find her bed sheets blackened at the corners. Her nightgown reeked of ash. The wooden floor beneath her feet had cracked, and etched into the planks beneath her bed was a single smoldering spiral. She didn't remember drawing it. By the 3rd night, Clara stopped sleeping. She sat by the window, eyes wide, watching the edge of the forest where the trees twisted. Her lips moved in silence. Her hands twitched like they were remembering how to gallop. The fire was not outside, it was inside her, and it was waking. Her mother found her at dawn. Clara was outside, barefoot, standing in the dew-covered grass. Her eyes were open but unfocused. Her nightgown was damp with sweat and ashes. Beneath her feet, the ground had seared into a perfect circle. She didn't speak. Not at first. Only when her mother stepped forward did Clara turn and whisper, "She's here." "Who, Clara?" Clara pointed to the trees. "She's inside the fire." That same day, Marta and João arrived. They had heard the stories of smoke curling through the canopy, of animals refusing to cross Clara's doorstep, of a girl who no longer blinked. João knocked gently. When the mother opened the door, she fell to her knees in relief. "She's not sick," she said. "She's changing." Clara emerged from the shadows. When she saw them, she smiled. Not like a girl who needed help, but like someone who had waited a very long time. Clara stood still for a long time. The sunlight barely touched her skin. It bent around her, as if unsure how to land. Her eyes never blinked, but they watched Marta, watched João, watched the notebook he carried like it was scripture. "She's remembering through me," Clara said, her voice low. João stepped forward. "Do you know her name?" Clara nodded slowly. "All of them." She walked to the center of the yard and knelt, her hands pressed into the dirt. Smoke hissed up around her fingers. When she drew them away, there were spirals. Perfect. Twin. Flames carved into the soil. Marta lit a candle. The flame curved sideways, like it was reaching toward Clara. João opened the notebook and read Helena's name aloud. Then Beatriz, then the others. With each word, Clara inhaled deeper. When he stopped, she exhaled. The spirals at her feet ignited, but they didn't consume. They revealed, beneath the flame, another mark had been waiting, a 3rd spiral. And beneath, it, etched into stone that hadn't been there before, was Clara's name. João dropped to one knee, brushing the soot from Clara's name. The stone was warm to the touch. It pulsed, not like fire, but like breath. "She hasn't transformed yet," Marta said, kneeling beside him. "But it's already begun." Clara remained still, eyes closed. Her chest rose and fell with slow, deep rhythm. Her hair floated, slightly, as if touched by wind that no one else could feel. "She's becoming the flame," João whispered. Clara opened her eyes. "No, I'm becoming the memory." The spiral brightened. And for the first time, Marta saw it clearly. Not just as a symbol, but as a map, a path. A lineage of fire connecting each of the women, binding their stories like thread through flesh. João stood and stepped back. From within his satchel he withdrew the repaired mask, the one mended with golden twine. He placed it gently before Clara. She looked down at it, and without hesitation, placed it on her face. The flames didn't rise. They bowed. The clearing was silent, the kind of silence that hummed. Around Clara, the spirals began to glow, not just beneath her, but in the trees, in the stone, in the air. Shapes pulsed in golden ember light, forming constellations in the canopy. João watched, frozen. Marta fell to her knees, not in fear but in reverence. The mask on Clara's face shifted, it moved with her breathing, and when she stood, the flames followed. Not from her, but around her, forming a crown, a cloak, a presence. She took one step forward. The earth responded, roots lifting, parting, revealing a trail. Not a new path, an old one forgotten, and at the end of it, beyond the shimmer of smoke and memory, a shadow stepped forward, another woman, Helena. Clara reached out, and Helena took her hand. Two fires, one walk. The fire didn't burn them, it illuminated them. Clara and Helena moved through the trail of spirals, side by side, their feet not touching the ground, but brushing against the memory of it. Trees leaned in as they passed, stones whispered. Wind carried the echo of names long buried. João and Marta followed, not as guides, but as witnesses. The path led to a circle of stone and ash, older than any map, older than São Miguel. In the center stood a mound of scorched earth. It breathed. Helena stepped forward and knelt. Her fingers dug gently into the soil. Clara did the same. Together they unearthed something wrapped in burned linen, an iron bridle fused with bone. João gasped. It was the original, the first, forged in silence, buried in guilt. Clara lifted it, gently, and for the first time since the spiral had begun to turn, it cracked. The crack echoed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it carried through the trees, through the soil, through time. João staggered back, as if struck. Marta gasped, clutching her chest. The bridle, once whole, began to unravel, not break but unmake. The metal peeled away like petals of rusted iron, revealing threads of hair, twine, and sinew wrapped at its core. Clara held it with reverence. It was never meant to bind, she whispered. Helena nodded. It was meant to erase. The bridle dissolved in Clara's hands. The ashes fell into the soil, and the spiral beneath them flared with golden light. From within the circle, voices rose, not screaming, not crying. Singing low, harmonized, beautiful, names spoken in chorus. The air grew warm, not with fire, but with peace. Clara looked at Helena, and Helena smiled. Now they will remember. Chapter 8. The Spiral of Fire. The spiral burned in the sky, not metaphor, not symbol. Real flame. Seen from villages hundreds of kilometers away. Some said it was a comet, others a sign of judgment. But those who had walked with fire, those who remembered the names, knew what it was. It was a calling. Clara led them, not as a girl, not even as a rider. She walked as flame. Her body glowed with a soft, radiant ember light, not consumed, not devoured, transformed. Behind her walked Helena, then Beatrice, and behind them others, hundreds, women once forgotten, now walking beneath the spiral. João and Marta stood at the crest of the valley, watching it all. The fire didn't destroy, it gathered. Villagers joined from every direction, silent, reverent, barefoot. No one shouted. No one wept. The fire rose like a choir, and in the center of the spiral, Clara raised her hand. The ground opened. The final name was ready to be written. Marta stepped forward. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes held steady as she opened the notebook, its pages now crackling with heat, its spine lined with ash. Clara looked back, her mask glowing softly. Marta whispered, "Whose name?" Joan touched her arm. "Yours." Marta shook her head. But then the wind answered. It spun in a slow circle, lifting leaves, dirt, petals, and embers. In its center, a whisper not in words, but in warmth. "She carried us. Now carry her." Marta hesitated, then nodded. She bent, pressed the quill into the open page and wrote, "Marta Silva." The page burned, not black, not red. Gold. The spiral flared, and Marta rose, not consumed but crowned. The light from the spiral spread through the valley, into the trees, across the sky. Marta's form shimmered in the firelight, her body cloaked not in flame, but in memory. The name she had spoken echoed behind her, rising like a chant. Clara stood beside her, no longer a girl. Not quite a woman, something more. Together they stepped to the heart of the spiral. The ground parted, not violently, like a gate, and from beneath the earth came a breeze unlike any they had felt before, cool, fragrant with old prayers and soot. Helena emerged. She no longer walked. She hovered, her arms outstretched. She touched Marta's forehead and whispered, "The last fire is yours." Then she turned to Clara, "And you will carry it forward." Marta bowed her head as Helena's touch lingered. It didn't burn, it remembered, and as she opened her eyes, flames danced across her shoulders, gentle, golden, like sunlit leaves swirling in slow wind. The crowd around the spiral fell silent, witnesses from 100 villages, generations, some old, some barely older than Clara had been. João stepped into the light, his eyes brimmed with tears. He had seen the curse begin, and now he was watching it become something else. "Not fire to punish," he whispered. "Fire to carry." Marta raised her arms, and the spiral rose, not from the earth, from them. A spinning flame of every name they had spoken, every silence they had broken. It moved upward like a column of breath and heat, lighting the night without destroying it. And at its peak, the mask, whole, woven from every face it had ever known, and waiting for the next. The mask hovered above the spiral, spinning slowly. It pulsed with memory, not just of pain, but of love, of defiance, of truth spoken too late and finally heard. Clara reached up. The fire leaned toward her, wrapping around her wrist like a ribbon. She did not flinch. She did not tremble. She took the mask. The crowd inhaled as one. A wind surged through the clearing, lifting skirts and scattering leaves. The spiral rose higher, glowing white now, bright enough to light the horizon. Clara placed the mask on her face, and everything stopped, for a heartbeat, for a breath. Then the spiral burst outward, not in destruction, but in release. Its fire scattered in thousands of thin threads, each one flying to a new place, a new soul, a new silence waiting to be broken. Across the land, candles lit themselves. Names were spoken in sleep, and the hoofbeats began again, not of the curse, of the memory, of the fire that would never again walk alone. If this story spoke to something deep inside you, don't let the fire go out. Share it. Speak the names. Remember the silence that came before, because the spiral doesn't end here. It waits in shadows, in stories, in you. Subscribe for more real horror, born of truth and blood. And if you ever Hear hooves in the dark. Don't look away. Listen, subscribe now, join the ones who remember.